Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series, Health Disparities in the MS Community. Our first webcast today is focused on the African American experience. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tyler, and I will be the operator for the presentation today. Before we get started, I would like to take a few moments to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the text chat window. There is a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you will type in your questions. To send a question or report a technical issue, click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the send button. All questions that you submit are only seen by today's presenters. Your questions will be responded to in the order in which they were received and will be addressed at the end of the presentation. At the conclusion of today's program, you will be prompted to complete an evaluation. Your feedback will help us to improve our future programs. We are joined today by our moderator, Marie LeGrand, Director of Education and Healthcare Relations and Grant Management with the Multiple Sclerosis Association of America, and our speaker, Dr. Mitzi Joi Williams with Joy Life Wellness Group MS Center. At this time, I would like to turn the microphone over to our moderator, Marie, for opening remarks. Marie?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Multiple Sclerosis Association of America's live webinar with Dr. Mitzi Joi Williams, entitled The African American Experience in MS. I am Marie LeGrand, Director of Education, Healthcare Relations, and Grant Management for MSAA, and your host for the program this evening. We are pleased to bring you the last program in the Health Disparities series in the MS community. This program is designed to bring you the latest research in MS, emerging therapies, and strategies for MS symptom management. This program has been made possible through educational funding from Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono, Genentech, and Sanofi Genzyme. You will have the opportunity to ask Dr. Williams questions at the end of the presentation. Before introducing Dr. Williams, please join us in holding a moment of silence for 1 minute in support of equality, social justice, and human rights. Thank you. I am honored to bring back Dr. Mitzi Joi Williams. Dr. Williams is a neurologist specializing in MS and serves as the founder and CEO of the Joy Life Wellness Group MS Center in Union, Georgia. She provides personalized MS care delivered with expertise, compassion, and joy. Joy Life Wellness is your final destination in a quest for comprehensive and compassionate MS care, providing medical care and telemedicine. Dr. Williams has over 15 years of experience in the field of MS, receiving her undergraduate degree in neuroscience and behavioral biology from Emory University and her Doctor of Medicine degree from Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. She completed her internal medicine internship, neurology residency, and MS fellowship at Georgia Health Sciences University in Augusta, Georgia, where she received numerous awards and scholarships and served as chief resident of the neurology residency program. She has spearheaded and participated in multiple steering committees and work groups to further research in underserved populations with MS, with a focus on the African American population, and has also recently joined efforts to increase diversity in clinical research and educate the community about the importance of research participation. Through collaborations with national and international MS committees, such as National MS Society, she advocates for people living with MS to share in the decision-making process with their healthcare teams to combat this disease. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mitzi Joi Williams.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Marie, and good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you all this evening and talk about a topic that is extremely important to me, and that is MS in the Black community, or the African American experience with multiple sclerosis. As Marie said, I live in I live in Atlanta, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta, and so I started a practice, and I love taking care of people with MS. So let's just jump right into it. Okay. So this is just an overview of what we'll cover today. We'll talk a little bit about understanding the characteristics of MS in the African American population. We'll talk about some of the challenges to care, some of the barriers to research participation, and then also some potential solutions. So now let's talk about the face of multiple sclerosis. So as I was coming along in my training, which was a little while ago, not too long ago, but as I was coming along in my training as a neurologist and neurology resident, a medical student, this is the face that most people associated with multiple sclerosis. So whenever I learned about MS, I learned that MS was a disease that was primarily in white people. And so if we look at the incidence of MS across the world, that is still the case, but we're finding that these demographics are changing, especially here in the United States. So looking at kind of the world, view of MS and the incidence. So the incidence is highest in Europe. Okay, so we can see here on the right-hand side in the UK, Scandinavia, it's about 130 to 190 per 100,000, which is a lot. We can also see that the prevalence is pretty high in North America as well. So if you look in the U.S., it's 30 to 150, Canada, 60 to 250. If we look from the data that we have in Africa, which is a huge continent, we don't hear a lot about cases of multiple sclerosis, especially among Black Africans. So it's very rarely reported, even in areas where there are, academic centers where people are able to be diagnosed. We see very little report of MS in that region. And so what do we know about multiple sclerosis? We know that it occurs a lot more frequently, and it's a lot more common than we previously thought. So we have these numbers that we would quote that we didn't have good research to back, but for a while we were saying there were 200,000 people with MS in the United States. And then maybe 5 years later we'd say, there are 400,000 people in the United States with MS. But there was a prevalence study that was completed last year that was partially sponsored by the MS Society that suggested nearly 1 million people in the United States live with MS. And there are some that believe that that number is still not even close to how many people may actually have MS. And so what do we know about the face of the MS in the U.S.? Well, we know that it probably occurs a lot more commonly in Black people than we thought. So we used to think that the numbers were extremely low, but there was a study published in 2013 by Kaiser Permanente in Southern California that suggested that the risk for MS may be up to 47% higher in Black women. And that was something that was absolutely astounding and extremely contrary to what I had learned, coming along as a student and as a resident, and to what many of us thought. So this is just another look at that same data. And so what we can see here is this is the total incidence of multiple sclerosis in a very large group of people. Kaiser Permanente is a huge health system that spans many different parts of the country. And so we see the blue line is white, the green line is Black. The light blue is Hispanic, and then kind of the blue-green is Asian Pacific Islander. And so we can see here that the total incidence is highest in Black people. So we can see that green bar is very high. When we look at females or women, we see that the divide is a lot bigger. So we can see differences 9.25 versus 14.72. But when we look at the men, the difference is not that big. So we can see that the difference that we see, or the higher incidence, is largely accounted for by Black women with MS. And that makes sense because the majority of people who have MS are women. So what do we know about the prevalence in Africa? So if we look at Southern Africa, as was kind of detailed on that big world map that we saw, the incidence in white South Africans is about 13 per 100,000. In colored or mixed genetic background South Africans, 3. And then there have only been about cases reported in Black South Africans. So again, very, very rare. And usually I look up these statistics every time I get ready to do a talk, on this subject. But we just don't see a lot of MS in Black Africans, but we see a lot of MS in Black people who live in America. So now, this begs the question, what does it mean to be Black, or what does it mean to be African American? And so it's a very interesting conversation that I had with one of my colleagues who's from Algeria, who looks nothing like me. And then I have other colleagues who, are of Asian background, but are actually from South Africa. So there are many people who can say they are African American. Primarily what we mean when we talk about Black people or African Americans are those who live in the U.S. and who are descendants of those who migrated here because of the slave trade. But certainly people who actually are from African or have African descent can come from many different parts of the world and be here in the U.S. But, the big question I always ask if you were here in person with me would be, how do we know somebody is Black? And the answer is, we can look at how they look, but mostly because they say so, right? So how do we know that someone is Black? We don't go around doing genetic tests on everyone, but certainly there are certain physical features. But, when we look at actual ancestry of what we would call African Americans, about 70 to 80% of the genes of most people who consider themselves Black would be African ancestry, and then about 20% European ancestry. But the main thing is that it is determined by self-identification. So if someone says they are, Black or identifies as Black, then that's how they are classified. Now, the question about why we see more MS in African Americans versus in people who are Black who live actually on the continent of Africa is that maybe some of that mixed genetic ancestry may make the difference, right? So there are a higher percentage of European genes. And then also environmental factors may play a role. There are studies that have been going on for years that suggest that if people are in a low-risk area for MS and they move to a higher-risk area, then maybe they take on the risk of that area that they live in. So what are some of the clinical characteristics of MS in African Americans? So this is data from several studies that suggest that disease progression is faster in Black people, both on brain MRIs, meaning more lesions, as well as in visual dysfunction or loss of visual problems. We also see that there's more atrophy or shrinkage of the brain that occurs twice as fast in Blacks versus Caucasians. And then also there's faster atrophy of the thalamus, which is a part of the brain that is linked to some of our cognition and some of our thinking. So again, these are some of the characteristics we've seen from several studies about how MS may present or how the disease may progress in Black people. And then I think the other piece that's very important to highlight is that even when we look at mortality, this was a study that was done by Dr. Liliana Amescua at USC that looked at people where MS was listed as the primary cause of death. And this is a wide span of time from 1999 to 2015. But what they found was that overall, if you look at kind of the top peak with the light blue line, overall, when you get closer to ages 60, 65, 74, there are obviously more white people that die of MS as the primary cause compared to other groups. But if you look in the younger group, right, so if you look over to the left at the 25-year range, kind of going all the way up until maybe about 40 years old, we can see that dark blue line that Black people tend to die earlier of MS. And the suggestion is that maybe there is more disease burden, maybe there is more disability that is causing people to die at younger ages. So there's a lot that we need to understand. What about racial disparities in neurologic care? So why could this be, right? Why do we see worse outcomes? So certainly the big question is there some biologic basis, right? So are our immune systems a little more active, or is it more social determinants of health, right? We can't get to the doctor. Maybe we don't have as much access to medications. And so this is a study that was published in 2017 that looked at access to neurologic care, and this is not just for MS, this is across all specialties for neurology, I'm sorry. And so what they found was that African Americans were about 30% less likely to see a neurologist more likely to seek care in the emergency room, to have inpatient stays at the hospital, and to have higher hospital expenses. And I think, the sad part is that there was a study that was also published probably around 2007, 2008 that looked specifically at MS. And if you would guess, who were the folks who had the least access to MS specialists or neurologic care with a neurologist? You guessed it, right on that list was African Americans or Black people. So there definitely is an issue with access to care that may be contributing to some of the poorer outcomes that we're seeing in our population. This study, I was fortunate to be a second author on this study that was published back in 2014, where we looked at all of the data and all of the literature that we had that focused on minorities. We looked specifically at African American, and we looked at Hispanic, Latino Americans in the U.S. And we just tried to see kind of how much information was there available. When I first started doing these talks maybe 10 to 15 years ago, I could literally fit every paper about MS in Black people in one 3-ring binder, because that's how little information there was. And so when we did this study in 2014, there were only about 113 papers that were written in English focused on Black people, and only 23 that focused on Hispanic Americans. And that is out of nearly 60,000 articles that are published, and over 50,000 that were written in English. So out of 50,000 papers about MS, a little over 100 were about Blacks, and less than 25 were about the Hispanic Latino population. And so this was less than 1% of the literature on MS. And so recently kind of looked this up again, and the numbers have increased, but it's still, less than 5% of the literature. And so, it begs the question that there's a lot that we need to learn and understand, and that we need to focus on this population to better understand. So what are some of the challenges to caring for African Americans with MS, from a, physician or healthcare provider perspective? So certainly one of the biggest challenges is that we don't have a lot of research. We know that Black people are underrepresented in clinical trials, okay, as you can see from the number of papers that we have, but there's concern because there may be poor outcomes. And so some of the unique differences also, not just the concern because of poor outcomes, but the more diversity that you have in research, the more we learn about a disease process. When you have people of different backgrounds and different heritages, we can learn more about how medications may work or not work, and we can also learn about the disease process itself. And so what are some of the challenges? So certainly socioeconomic status can be a challenge, especially if you don't have access to a neurologist or a specialist. If you don't have access to medications, that could be huge. Also, the poor diversity in clinical trials, which we kind of briefly discussed, and we'll discuss in a little bit more detail further along in the talk. Sometimes religious beliefs can be a bit of a barrier, especially when we talk about treatment options. Sometimes there is a thought that people want to be, people feel that they will be supernaturally healed or cured of MS, right? And so sometimes that can be a barrier, and we have to make sure that we as, physicians and healthcare providers respect people's religious beliefs, as well as providing kind of the science behind why we're doing what we're doing. And then also in some cases, there is distrust of the medical system and research, right? And rightfully so, right? So, as we are in this kind of season where we're learning more, there is much more of a voice and attention being paid to our community. Certainly some of these stories of injustices that have occurred are coming more to the forefront. And so, we have to be able to balance the knowledge of what has been with what we would like to see in the future. Now, so we talked about 1% of the literature being about minorities with MS, okay? And if we look at research as a whole, minority patients comprise less than 10% of clinical trial participants, right? And so let's kind of delve into that. So when we look at the trials, so African Americans in some of our major clinical trials, right? And I hate to name names, but I'm going to name names today, okay? So when we look at one of our interferon trials, right? So most of our clinical trials before medication gets approved our phase 3 trials usually have over 1,000 people in each trial. So we're talking maybe 1,200 to sometimes 1,500 people. And usually there are 2 large phase 3 trials that lead to a medication being approved, okay? So this is kind of looking at, some of the larger clinical trials with over 1,000 people. In one of the interferon studies, there were only 36 Black people in the study. When we look at natalizumab, out of the 2 studies, there were about 49 Black people. Fingolimod had a higher number in their clinical trial program. They had about 62 between the 2 trials. There were 24 with teriflunomide, 29 with dimethyl fumarate, and then about 55 with alemtuzumab. So the reason that I like to highlight this is because if you think of clinical trials, if you have 2 large clinical trials with, let's say, 2,500 people in them, and you only have 40 Black people, you cannot make any kind of generalization about how medications may work or about different characteristics of disease with only 40 people. You can't generalize. And in our earlier trials, the earlier trials were compared to placebo, which was kind of the standard of practice, meaning there was one person who was on medication, and then there was a group that was not on medication. And so out of the 49 or out of the 36, some of those people may have even been on placebo and not on medication. So all of that to say, you can't learn a lot with very small numbers of people. And so if we look at some of the data that we have, there are some sub-analyses that have been published that basically try to help us understand at least what we have, the data that we have. And so when we look at disease activity, this was from one of the interferon trials. Out of the 36 African Americans that were in the trial, there seemed to be a little bit more aggressive disease, and people maybe did not perform as well on that medication. But again, you can't make a generalization with only 36 people. If we look at the data from some of the natalizumab trials, out of 49% of folks, people did seem to perform equally as well in terms of their response to medication. But again, it's very difficult to make a generalization out of 49 people. And then this was a sub-analysis looking at alemtuzumab, which is one of our other medications. People did, African-American or Black patients did tend to perform similar to the other groups in terms of how effective the medicine was. And then the same with the ESTEEM trial with dimethyl fumarate. And this is a paper that we just published, matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago. And so, we are finding, and so this had a larger number of African Americans in the study. So this is a sub-study specifically looking at African Americans. And then we also had one that looked at the Hispanic population. And so, we had about 187 people in these groups. So there are higher numbers and there are people that are looking to try to understand our treatment responses better, but we have a long way to go. So when we talk about kind of social determinants of health, and we're going to come back and talk about research a little bit, but when we talk about social determinants of health, what does that mean? So that means a lot of different things. So that means access to healthcare services, transportation, language and literacy, access to media and different types of technology, as well as, access to educational and job opportunities. And this was a survey that we looked at. So I think that last slide was probably misplaced. But this is a survey that we looked at, kind of going back to research, that talked about what are some of the attitudes of medical research. And so I worked with this group called the MS Minority Research Partnership Engagement Network. And so what we did was we did a survey asking white people, Black people, Hispanic Latino people, as well as Asian people, kind of what were their thoughts about research. And so we had at least 200 African Americans and 200 Hispanic Latino Americans in the study. And so what we found was that most of the responses about research were very positive. So people wanted to find a cure for MS. They associated these words, better causes, to find the disease, to help understand the disease. And so what we found, going back to the slide, what we found was that when we asked people would they be willing to be involved in research, the majority of people in all groups actually said they would. And when you looked at the reasons why Black people weren't involved in research, many of them said they weren't asked and they didn't know where to find information about being involved in clinical research. So this kind of goes back to the big question, right? So is it biology that's causing, MS to be worse in Black people, or is it social determinants of health? And we really don't know the answer, but one of the ways that we can find that is through clinical research. So why is it important to increase diversity in clinical trials? So number one, we talked about how minorities are underrepresented in research and how kind of our unique differences can help contribute to the body of knowledge. And so also the lack of involvement in research impacts our ability to generalize it, right? So again, when we talk about effectiveness, when we talk about side effects, all of these things are kind of a part of the research process. And so this was a great article that was published in actually a cardiology journal that talked about some of the barriers to involvement in research. And certainly some of them are listed here on the left side: mistrust, lack of comfort with the process, information, time, resources, and constraints, and as well as awareness. So knowing where to find the research, having the time to do it, having information about it, and feeling comfortable with the process. And let me pause and say that, clinical trials are not for everybody. And I by no means generalize and say that everybody needs to be in a clinical trial when it involves medications or procedures, because that's something that everybody has their own, personal ideas about, their own risks that they're willing to take. But what I can say is that there is a part that everyone can play in the research process. So it may not be a clinical trial. There are registries, there are questionnaires, there are research projects that look at exercise, that look at diet and MS. There's a lot of different ways for us to be involved. So my encouragement is usually to get in where you fit in, right? So if this piece is not for you, there are other things that we can do to help improve our understanding of MS and basically to help understand why MS can be so severe in our population. So some of the strategies, to improve diversity in clinical trials don't just come from us as healthcare come from people living with MS, but also us as healthcare providers. So, we have to kind of broaden our eligibility criteria, make sure that it's not so burdensome on people, and make sure that we're reaching out to get everyone involved. So now, kind of switching gears, the other thing that I like to talk about when we talk about MS in the Black community is to talk about empowerment, right? Because I found that when I first started giving these talks, I would present all the data and everybody would leave depressed, right? So that is not the goal. The goal is for you to understand that some outcomes can be worse, but also to understand what we can do to take control of our own health. And so this is kind of a list of things that come top of mind. So number one, learn about your diagnosis, right? There are programs like this, programs provided by the MSAA, the NMSS, many different organizations, the MS Views and News, that try to help educate the public about different aspects of MS. And so, it's important to kind of take that time to understand your diagnosis as well as treatment options. I think another important way to take control of your health or to be empowered is once you have a treatment plan that you come up with your healthcare provider, stick with it, right? And if you're having problems, let somebody know so that you can come up with a new plan. My 2 rules of thumb that I tell all my patients are, number one, if you could see me, you could see me wagging my thumb. Number one is, the plan is not written in stone. And then number 2 is, if this plan is not working, we come up with a new plan, right? So, we want to make sure that we're sticking with what we have, but if we're having problems, we let somebody know. And the other important things that we'll get a little bit more into are healthy diet and exercise, right? Those things help your overall health, but also help your brain health, which is extremely important. Talking to your team if you have concerns. Another piece that I like to talk about is finding your tribe and support system. Having a chronic disease like MS involves a lot of support. Asking for help when you need it, and making sure that you remember that you are your own best advocate. So how do we maintain brain health? So this is a really interesting concept that's really come to the forefront. Probably in the past, it's been around for a long time, but really in the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot more about brain health. And so what does that mean? That means that basically, we have what we call a reserve of brain function. And so what happens with MS is that over time, as we develop more lesions, as we develop more disability, that reserve begins to decrease and issues become more apparent. But the higher our reserve is, the better off we'll do in the long term. And so things that we can do to improve our reserve are to maintain our brain health. So physical activity helps keep our brain healthy. A healthy diet helps. Controlling other medical conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, those things can affect our brain health. Also limiting alcohol intake, because chronic alcohol use and especially abuse can actually affect your brain and your brain function, as well as smoking. So things that kind of help with your overall health, your cardiovascular health, can also help with your brain health. And one of the major questions that people ask me is, Dr. Williams, what can I do to help myself? And so these are some practical tools that you can use to help yourself on a daily basis. Yoga and meditation. So I'm a big yogi and meditation fan. And so for a variety of reasons. So number one, when we talk about exercise like yoga, it actually helps with focus and concentration, but also can help many of the different symptoms of MS. So if your exercise is not yoga, whatever your exercise is, we can help decrease symptoms like spasticity. We can also improve muscle strength with exercise. Also, we can actually help with exercise constipation. So if you feel stopped up, exercise helps get things moving. So those things are very important. And the reason I particularly like yoga is because there is a level for everyone. And it definitely helps with things like balance. It helps with spasticity, stretching, and also can help with focus and attention. And then meditation, because obviously there's a lot of stress. So there is stress from the real world and just regular life. And then when you add MS on top of that, especially with the unpredictability, it can be very stressful. And then, of course, we now have times where we have so much stress related to, many of the things that are going on in our community, with social injustice, as well as a whole pandemic that's going on as well. And so meditation can help really focus on the mind and help decrease stress. And so these are two things that I recommend for many of my patients. And how about addressing depression and anxiety? And I always like to put this separately as a topic because, the stigma associated with mental health services is improving in our community. You can see a lot of people, celebrities coming to the forefront talking about therapy very openly. But certainly I still have some folks, who don't want to take quote unquote crazy pills. Who don't want to be viewed as crazy. I think the importance of recognizing depression and anxiety is huge with MS because sometimes the symptoms overlap with MS symptoms. Depression can cause fatigue. Depression can cause difficulty with attention. And so oftentimes I have patients that come in and say, Dr. Williams, I'm having this issue, and it's important for us to distinguish if it's the MS or if it's depression and anxiety. Because if it's depression and anxiety, then we need to address that specifically. But if it's the MS, then we need to be thinking about switching your treatment, right? And those are two very totally different ways of approaching things. So it's important to address depression and anxiety just like we would address physical symptoms because it affects our overall health, but also can really affect how, MS may be treated because some of those symptoms can overlap. And so I look at taking care of your mental health as just as important as taking care of your physical health because the two are very interconnected. And it's also important to recognize that a very large number of people with MS will deal with depression at some point in the course of their disease, roughly 50%. And so it is very common, okay? And the other piece is recognizing that you're not alone in this. So just kind of projects to kind of touch on that, are ongoing. So this is one that I've been working on for a while, and I believe Maria is a part of this group as well, the MS Minority Research Engagement Partnership Network is the word that I left off. And so this is a group that is really looking at trying to help understand MS in the Black community and also provide tools for both patients and for healthcare providers and researchers to make sure that we understand the research process and that we know that that is an option if that is something that we're interested in, and also to underscore the importance of diversity in clinical trials. Also, not coming to a theater near you, but hopefully in the fall, we will be launching, myself and some of my colleagues, the first National African Americans with MS Registry, which will be an informational registry to help understand some of the risk factors for MS in our population, understand kind of patterns of treatment, and also understand the course of disease. So that is very exciting news. We've been working on this for several years, and it's finally coming to fruition. And then the kind of one of the last pieces I wanted to leave you with was this graphic, because I really love this, the future. So MS treatment has come a very long way, and I know that there is not a cure. And when I talk to my patients, I usually tell them, well, there's not a cure for most diseases, right? If we think about hypertension, if we think about diabetes, if we think about, many conditions that people deal with, there often aren't cures, but we're able to manage MS a lot better than we were even 5 or 10 years ago. So it's a very hopeful time, I believe, for MS, because we not only have different treatments to offer, but I believe that as a scientific community, the goals are moving the goals are becoming more progressive. So we move from, just trying to slow progression to actually trying to stop the disease in its tracks. And now there's a lot of research looking to see how we can reverse the damage that's been done. And we have a long way to go, but we've come a very long way. And so I'm very hopeful, maybe not in my lifetime, that we will find a cure for MS. And so I think we're moving closer and closer to that goalpost. And just kind of wrapping up, excuse me, if you want to find me, this is how you find me. I am the nerdy neurologist, and I have, I'm on social media, on Instagram and Twitter. I have videos that I post on YouTube as well as Facebook. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Just talking about MS, I love to educate. I love to empower people, make sure they understand the disease. And I end every talk with this graphic. All I need is peace, love, and a freaking cure for multiple sclerosis. Thank you so much for your time and attention, especially taking out time on this Tuesday evening to talk a little bit about MS in the Black community. And so what I will do is I will have Marie open it up. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll turn it back over to Marie for the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. We have come to the question and answer portion of our program. And the first question that we have is, are we considered high risk with this COVID-19 situation?
That's a great question. Now, we have a lot of data that's emerging looking at COVID-19 in the MS community in general. I cannot say that there is a lot of data looking at MS and COVID-19 in African Americans as of right now. But so far, from the data that we have, there's an Italian MS registry, there is a U.S. MS registry, and there's a global MS registry looking at these very topics. And so far, it doesn't appear that just having MS increases the risk of COVID-19. Also, what we've seen from very, very small numbers of people, right? So the Italian registry, the last time I checked, had like 600 people, and the U.S. registry had maybe close to 200 or more. It doesn't appear that the medications, that there's any one medication that puts people at increased risk for more severe disease. It seems that what puts people at risk for bad outcomes with MS are the same things that put people at risk for bad outcomes with COVID period, which is age over 60 and comorbidities that are uncontrolled, like diabetes and hypertension. Now, again, the numbers we have are very, very small. And so as we get more information, we'll be able to understand better. But it actually was pretty reassuring that, from the data that we have, it doesn't appear that one medication in particular, has all bad outcomes. And it doesn't appear that people with MS, just by nature of having MS, are at increased risk for poor outcomes. Great question.
Thank you. How many Black people participate in clinical trials for Ocrevus?
That is a great question. Then it's a shame because I actually am an author on a paper that we're getting ready to publish. I believe it was in the 30 to 40 range, but don't quote me on that. I'll have to go back and look, but we're getting ready to author a paper with a sub-analysis from the original trials from Ocrevus, looking at African Americans with MS. So hopefully that will be published within the next couple of months. But I believe it was over 30.
Thank you. And to answer this next question, we will have a recording of this webinar on my MSAA website. So you will be able to view this information once again. The next question that we have, has there been a DMT proven to work better in Blacks?
So there hasn't been one yet that's been proven to work better. I think, from what we could see from those sub-analyses that we looked at a little bit earlier, for most of the medications, they seem to perform equally as well in African Americans. But again, we have very small numbers of people. So, we'll see once we get more data to help us better understand MS. But so far, the short answer is no, but certainly, the goal is to make sure that these medications are equally as effective in these groups.
In your research and practice, have you found that certain medications work better for African Americans?
So I can't say that I have. I think that most of us as neurologists try to classify people that we think will have mild disease versus those that we think will have more severe disease and choose treatments based on that. And it's very interesting that over the past 10 years or so, when we look at prognostic factors, meaning factors that tell us prognosis, whether someone will do well or whether someone will do poorly, in the past 10 years or so, now African American is listed as a poor prognostic factor when that was not listed like that when I started practice. So I think that, the short answer is there are not certain medications that we choose. MS treatment is very individualized. So, if you talk to 10 people with MS, they're doing 10 different things. But certainly, we try to pick the best medication for that person based on their disease course.
What is your experience with Tecfidera medication?
So again, I don't want to get into the weeds about specific medications. There was actually data, though, a paper that we just published looking at Tecfidera. And so African Americans did tend to do equally as well on that medication as their Caucasian counterparts and those kind of in the original trials. I think that with every medication, there are certain potential side effects. And like with any other medication, I have some patients that do extremely well, and I have some patients that don't do so well. So I think it just really varies depending on the person.
Have you seen or noticed that alternative treatments, such as vitamin D or vitamins, CBD, and others have helped with MS?
Right. So it depends on what you mean by help, right? So again, when we think about the way we treat MS, I look at it as a 4-layer cake because I like cake. Okay. So it's a 4-layer cake. The first layer of the cake is for, in my mind, and it's not in order of importance. The first layer is when someone has a relapse, we have certain treatments for that. The second layer of the cake is disease modifying therapy, which we use to help treat the underlying disease. And maybe I should expand my cake to 5 layers. The third layer is symptom management, okay, which can include medications for certain symptoms, but also can include, complementary medicine or alternative medicine. And then the fourth layer is physical therapy if we need that. So in that third layer, when we talk about symptom management, yes, I've had people who've taken a variety of different vitamins that they feel may have helped certain things like their energy. I do have patients that use CBD that may help certain symptoms, but we have to make sure we distinguish that from treatments that actually decrease the immune system attack, right? So those things, although they may help certain symptoms and may help, kind of overall feeling of well-being in some cases, do not actually treat the underlying immune system being overactive and attacking your nerves and causing the lesions and the symptoms that we see related to MS.
Thank you.
Ooh, it's a lot of questions in that chat box.
I know. Okay. Well, we have about 15 minutes, so I'm sure we can get through
we're
these
good.
questions.
We'll get this music in. Yeah.
All right. So this is a two-part question. What is the latest on research on medications that can repair damaged melanin? And the second part is, once repaired, can the impacted MS symptom disappear?
Right. So that's a great question, but a largely theoretical one at this point. So we did have one medication that everyone was really hoping would have a positive trial for myelin repair that did not meet its primary endpoint, which was kind of decreasing relapses. There are several other medications that are currently in earlier trial phases that are being looked at for myelin repair. I think one of the biggest issues that, we have to look at is, number one, when we talk about MS is a very dynamic disease, right? So if we were to have an agent that repairs the myelin, and let's say regrows myelin, number one, how do we stop it from growing, right? So once it's fixed, what's already there, how do we keep people from, let's say, developing tumors because it just keeps growing, right? And then the other piece is that because MS is so dynamic and people can develop a lesion here this year and maybe somewhere else the next year, how does that medicine fix all the new areas potentially that could be damaged? So I think we have a lot of questions that we're asking, but, we have a couple of drugs that are in early phases that we're hoping will actually help repair myelin. And then the second part about the lesion, I guess the question is, could the MS disappear? I think that if we were to find when we find a cure for MS, it will likely involve something that kind of prevents things from happening. I think it's going to be very difficult to kind of move backwards and totally repair everything as a way of curing MS and making it disappear. But we'll see. There are a lot of very, very smart people, way smarter than me, that are trying to answer these questions. Okay, did we lose Marie?
I'm here. Did you hear me? I said, what is the best diet for MS patients?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I missed you. Okay, best diet, there is not a particular diet that works better for MS versus others. The one that has the most research is the Mediterranean diet, like a heart-healthy diet. But personally, I've had patients who have had every type of diet. I think the main kind of underlying theme with most of the diets, whether it's paleo, whether it is, Wall's protocol or whatever, is more raw, fresh foods and less processed foods. And everybody has their little spin on it. Don't eat meat, eat a lot of liver, or what have you. And my kind of rule of thumb is 9 times out of 10, when we put it in our mouths, we know if we should be eating it or not, right? And so, kind of educating yourself, picking a plan that you can stick to is the most important type of healthy diet that you can do within this.
Is it common for Black people with MS to have other or multiple autoimmune conditions?
Great question. So I do have multiple people with MS who have other autoimmune conditions. If I just kind of think top of mind of my patients who have multiple autoimmune conditions, from my experience here in Atlanta, a lot of them are Black, but I have a lot of Black patients here in Atlanta. So I cannot speak to the experience of many of my other patients, but I do have patients of all ethnicities who do have multiple autoimmune diseases, MS and lupus, MS and rheumatoid arthritis, MS and autoimmune thyroid disease. I can't say that there's data to suggest that it's more common in Black people.
The other question, why is it that Black men specifically have such a hard battle with MS?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the fellas really get kind of the short end of the stick. So when we talk about prognostic factors, Black men unfortunately kind of get that double whammy. So again, prognostic factor meaning something or a factor that can possibly predict if someone will do well or if someone will do poorly. So men in general tend to do worse with MS. MS is a disease that primarily occurs in women. But men in general tend to do worse, and Black people tend to do worse. So Black men, have both of those poor prognostic factors. And unfortunately, many of them have very severe disease if we don't catch it early and treat it effectively.
Thank you. Where can we find clinical trials to participate in?
So there are a variety of different places. So the first place to check is with your physician, your neurologist. If you are a part of an academic center like a university, or if you're at an MS center, oftentimes there are clinical trials that are running in that center. If you have a local neurologist who may be affiliated with an academic center, they may know about research studies. Sometimes you can also go online and look for like the MS center that's nearest you, and they will have research trials. In terms of looking for, registries and other things you can participate in, there are some groups, like I believe, I Conquer MS has some patient-driven research that they are involved in, and so there are often trials you can get in research you can get involved in there. And then also, if you look at websites like MSAA, National MS Society, they often have a list of some research projects that are going on or ongoing that are related to MS.
Thank you. Is there data available as to how many African Americans have relapse remitting, primary progressive, and secondary progressive types of MS? And the second part of the question, is it possible to eventually have all three?
So the second part is no. No. Primary progressive is totally different from relapsing remitting and secondary progressive. So relapsing remitting and secondary progressive are kind of a continuum. So you start out with relapsing remitting, where you have the symptoms that come and go, and over time, instead of primarily symptoms that come and go, you have more kind of slow worsening over time. Primary progressive is just kind of worsening from the start. So it's a totally separate category. So people cannot have all three of those. You either have, relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, kind of those are together, or primary progressive. The first part of the question is there's not data with specific numbers, but for many of the trials from the research that we do have, there's not a suggestion that Black people have more, let's say, primary progressive MS than white people. So we really haven't seen much of a difference between the subtypes of MS between different ethnicities from the data that we have.
I'm on Ocrevus. How can I get involved in future trials?
Right. So I think the answer to this question is very similar to what we talked about a little bit earlier. Asking your neurologist if there's an academic center near you, if there's an MS center near you that's conducting trials. Those are kind of the best places to start to see if there are any trials, especially involving the different medication that you're taking.
Is it true that treatment for MS actually affects your immune system?
So yes, that is the goal of treatment with MS, right? Because MS, and I didn't put an introductory slide in this presentation, but MS is a state of overactivity of your immune system. So your immune system is doing the most, as I like to say. So it's not only attacking viruses and bacteria, which can be harmful. It's not only doing surveillance to keep you from getting cancer, but it is also attacking you. And so it's attacking the myelin or the coating of the nerves, which results in the lesions that we see in the brain and spine, and also results in the symptoms that we see, depending on where the damage has been done. The goal of the therapies is to try to decrease that immune system overactivity, and there are a variety of different ways. I'm not going to go into each medication, but there are a variety of different ways in which the therapies try to accomplish that.
Thank you. Economics is huge in the way of long-term care, especially as the illness progresses. Are there any financial support programs available to offset so Black men and women can get in front of neurologists as opposed to stopping at the ER?
So that's a great, okay, so it sounds like kind of two different questions. So in the short term, are there programs that help Black men and women see neurologists? Not to my knowledge. I know that, certainly there are groups, like MSAA has some resources and National MS Society has resources to help you find neurologists that are close to you or find neurologists that specialize in MS. And then it's also a matter of inquiring about the practices of different practices. Many large MS centers, especially if they're academic centers or large private practice centers, do have programs that may, let's say, have a sliding scale based on your income. They may have charity programs if people don't have the resources. So it's important to kind of inquire about those things. Those things are not things that people advertise. Nobody really has a big sign that says, hey, we provide free care if you don't have any money. But certainly if most of the large centers, do have programs that can make care a little bit more accessible for people who may not have the same financial resources. Now, in terms of long-term care, meaning like nursing home, things of that nature, there really aren't programs to help with that. And that's not just for MS, that's period. Unfortunately, I had a family member who passed away recently, and they were very ill, and there's no money for long-term care. There's no money anywhere. So that's a problem that I think that probably our society as a whole needs to look at and try to ameliorate.
Thank you. What advice do you have for Black people living with MS who have largely felt alienated by the information they have found on the internet? Are there support groups specifically for Black people with MS?
Okay. Yeah, great question. And I keep saying that. They are great questions. I really do mean that. So there are resources, right? So one of the great things about social media is that it really can provide communities for people that aren't able to touch each other. Now, it can be a blessing and a curse, but there are some groups. Now, in terms of support groups, you would have to probably look to your local societies, like your local MS Society chapter, to see if there are any support groups in your area that are specific. There are African-American. I know there are several here in Atlanta and other parts of the country. In terms of virtual support, there are several folks that, have very large groups. I know that We Are Illmatic is a very large community of Black MS women. I know that there are other kind of folks who are on the forefront. I know that there's a podcast named Myelin and Melanin. I know that there are other people like Damian Washington who have good followings that are Black people with MS who kind of provide spaces where people can talk about some of the issues specific. But the other piece that I always tell people is that if you see a need, it might be a place for you to start, right? So I've had patients who started their own support groups if they saw a need that was there, and you'd be surprised at how many people are actually looking for the same thing and waiting for somebody to get it started.
What role does implicit bias play in the lower diagnosis and increased mortality of African Americans compared to Caucasians?
Yeah, that's a juicy one. So I believe it probably plays a large role. So again, in talking about educating patients or people living with MS, it's also important to educate the neurologic community, because many people still have those views of MS that I had, 10 or 15 years ago. And, fortunately, there's been a lot of research related to MS with new treatments, and you can get really caught up in other things. And unless you're looking at things like ethnic minorities with MS, you may miss that information. And so there's definitely a need for people to be educated, recognize that Black people do get MS, and a lot of Black people get MS. And so myself and many of my colleagues are working on efforts to try to increase awareness, improve understanding, and also to educate not only our current colleagues, but some of the folks that are in training, medical students, residents, fellows, about the importance of recognizing implicit bias and being actively working to decrease health disparities.
Okay. There are so many great questions. I'm going to try to take as many as possible. Do you find that there are symptoms from MS that Blacks experience more than other races?
Yes. So the presentation for MS in Black people is very similar to what we call Asian MS. So the most common symptoms they present with are optic nerve impairment or optic neuritis, and then spinal cord involvement. And spinal cord involvement meaning lesions in the spinal cord can cause, motor symptoms or difficulty walking. So African Americans are more commonly presenting with optical spinal MS. That's the short term for it, meaning optic nerve or visual involvement and spinal cord involvement.
Thank you. I will take one more after this. What medication or treatment do you? If you want,
I can take a couple more. If you want, I can take a couple more.
Okay. What medication or treatment do you suggest for patients with MS pain? Do you have patients who suffer from MS-related pain?
So pain is a symptom that we thought was not related to MS, but there are a lot of people with MS that have pain. And so it's now very well recognized. I don't have specific treatments that I recommend. It really depends on the type of pain. For me, as a specialist, the main thing is identifying the type of pain and treating that specifically. When we talk about medications, for instance, like narcotics, they really don't treat anything in particular. But if someone has spasticity, then we have medicines that help spasticity. Also, exercise helps that. If people have nerve pain, then there are medicines that treat nerve pain. So we try to identify the specific type of pain and then address that specifically so that we aren't just kind of giving medications for the sake of giving medications.
Okay. And then we'll take maybe 2 more questions after this one.
Okay.
What has attributed to Black males doing so poorly with MS?
So I think that we kind of discussed that. I think he had a similar question a little earlier on. So I think we've addressed that. The poor prognostic factors, men tend to do worse in terms of having more severe disease, as well as African Americans for some of the reasons we've discussed, but also, things that we need to, do more research to understand.
Okay. There's another one about vitamins too. Vitamins, and then there's stem cell. Are there any promising stem cell procedures?
Mm-hmm. So stem cell. So in terms of vitamins, so I'll quickly touch vitamins. So in terms of vitamins, the ones that tend to help neurologic function are vitamin D and B12. So those are ones that have specific, effects on the immune system and neurologic function. And then again, important things to talk to your doctor about which other ones they may recommend. In terms of stem cell, there's a lot of research surrounding stem cell. I think we have a long way to go. It's important to understand that stem cell research has been going on for years, like 30, 40 years. And again, there are ways that people are trying to refine the process. I think one of the biggest things is that the process is not standardized. So if you go get stem cell transplant in Chicago, it may be different from California. So there are a lot of people working to kind of standardize the process. But I think the other piece is identifying who's the right patient for stem cell transplant, because it is a very rigorous procedure, right? You don't just go get a stem cell transplant. And it also involves chemotherapy, which could affect risk for certain outcomes or certain side effects of some of our MS medications if it doesn't work. So I think it is very promising, but I think we have a lot of factors that we need to figure out before it becomes a more widely used treatment for MS.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Okay.
On behalf of MSAA, we would like to thank Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono, Genentech, and Sanofi Genzyme for making this program possible. We would once again like to thank Dr. Williams for the great presentation and Impact Education for their partnership in delivering this program. This concludes the Health Disparities series. Tonight's webinar was recorded and will be made available on our website at mymsaa.org. Please visit MSAA's calendar of events for upcoming webinars. I would also like to thank you for joining us this evening. Please consider completing a brief survey that immediately follows this slide. Please know that we are thinking of the entire MS community and hope that you and your families continue to stay safe. Thank you and have a good night.